US President Donald Trump called his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, quote, absolutely crazy before going on to say that he was playing with fire. Now, on the surface, it all may seem like political theater. And between these two aging strongmen, it seems like it's almost one step away from being a war of tabloid headlines. However, for those keen to actually understand how the Kremlin operates today and understand the Putin regime, it was fascinating and worth taking a look at. This was not chaos. This is choreography. So, anyone who studies Russia will tell you the reactions that we saw, the roles played, were exactly the recital of the roles played that we've seen for years now. And there's a reason that the Kremlin reacts this way to US or European leaders' remarks about them. The Kremlin responds not with this anger or fury, but rather cold precision. They like to always come across as cold and diplomatic. But Dmitry Medvedev, everybody's favorite former Russian president, is the designated nuclear provocateur. He always will threaten World War III or a nuclear Armageddon. It's what he does constantly. But that's not random. This was not by chance. And it's not just because Dmitry Medvedev is a drunk, which he probably is. It's because he is playing a role in a system, and it shows us a lot of how that system operates. Keep in mind, in a regime like Putin's, every voice has a role. Nothing is happening by chance. It is a dictatorship. So the fact that Putin stays above the fray, the spokesman comes out and he says soothing words, the propagandist goes nuts and rages, it's for a reason. It is to play specific roles in their administration, in their dictatorship. And it's actually a huge difference from the way that the US operates. If you look at US leaders, very often they'll refer to Putin as being, say, a bloodthirsty dictator or some sort of other term that's less than pleasant. Russian leaders do not do that. In Russia, the quote unquote free press, which doesn't exist, of course, their propagandists sponsored or backed by the state, are the ones who say the really outlandish things or will say things that are attacking others. But in the case of the United States, people really can say whatever they want to say, and our leaders, as well as op-eds and newspapers, will frequently target someone such as Putin, which is one of the reasons that Putin has often thought that it was unfair what was being said about him in the US press. It's something that he actually complained to George W. Bush when they met back, I want to say it was 2006 meeting, where he complained. He simply did not believe it was possible that the US press was attacking him regularly and that it was being done just by their own free volition. He was sincere in his belief that this was something that must be coordinated by Washington. So before we dive into specifically what it is Trump said, how we can interpret the response from the Kremlin, and why it is that Medvedev does what he does, Putin does what he does, etc., one big ask, one big favor, please like and subscribe to this channel. It helps me out. I really appreciate it. So let's go back to it though. So what happened? US President Donald Trump said that Putin had, quote, has gone absolutely crazy and that he's playing with fire, going on that nobody's ever seen anything like what he's doing. It's not going to end well if he keeps pushing like this. Now, the US president was referring to Putin's ongoing missile as well as drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, which so far have achieved nothing for Russia other than kill civilians. And so far, also interestingly, is that we see that Trump has been very cautious to not criticize Putin. He's, I think, made a heroic effort to avoid criticizing somebody who he has a very high opinion of, unfortunately. And let's not forget how high of opinion he has. Let's look back. Back in 2018, for instance, when Putin and Trump met, and you saw Trump sitting down, disheveled looking with his brow down and his shoulders bent forward. It was in that meeting that Trump went so far as to say that he believed what Putin was saying, that Putin had not been interfering in the US elections, and that he trusted him. In fact, he trusted him more than US intelligence reports, indicating that Russia, of course, had tried to manipulate the US elections outcomes. In 2022, don't forget, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, there was Trump to make sure that he could say positive words about his dear friend, Vladimir, and who he referred to as, quote, being a genius and, quote, savvy. And why is that? Because he thought the invasion of Ukraine was a savvy and genius move. That is, the US president had positive things to say about Putin's tactic. This is a fact. It is what he said. Now, what happened? Why is it that Donald Trump would shift all of a sudden? Or why is he now saying that Putin is crazy? Most likely because Donald Trump is self-interested. And the political calculus behind his decision has simply shifted. Putin's war is becoming increasingly a liability. And those within the Republican Party are also becoming a little bit worried about what's happening. We've seen what's been said so far by people, including J.D. Vance, for instance, who is by no means a friend of Ukraine, has said that the Russians are being unreasonable and what they're trying to put forward in these negotiations is not a good deal. It doesn't work. But more than that, just look at the U.S. Senate. Keep in mind, the U.S. Senate is majority Republican, just slightly, and yet we have 81 senators who have co-sponsored a bill to put new sanctions on Russia. The GOP is not excited to be the party of Putin. Though Trump might try to find excuses for his pal Vladimir, it's very hard to defend publicly. And it's something that he's not anxious to do, it would look like. So at this point, I think that Trump's move was a pivot. He sees that Putin doesn't look good. It doesn't help him. But it's a pivot that's actually very dangerous for Vladimir Putin. And that's the one that we're most interested in here. I'm far less interested in what the U.S. leader is doing because I think he doesn't know what he's doing. So I think it's easier to analyze what the Russians are doing because it usually does follow a very clear methodology that we can see replicated throughout history. So what we see is that the overall communication strategy of the Kremlin repeats. And that's why this time around when Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov came out with his statement and they asked him, so what do you make of this statement by Trump? He didn't explode. He didn't say anything insulting. He said, quote, this is simply emotional overload. Mr. Trump is under tremendous pressure. We don't take such statements personally. Now, that's pretty fascinating. Can you imagine the U.S. official responding that way? Can you imagine the U.S. president responding that way? I cannot. But going further, speaking with Tsargrad TV, Peskov, the spokesman of the Kremlin, said, quote, we are grateful to Mr. Trump for his contributions to peace negotiations. We remember his efforts, end quote. That's image control. That's disciplined messaging. The Kremlin doesn't want to open conflict with Trump. Certainly not when he might be their last lifeline. So they ignore the insult and keep the door open. But the Kremlin is not all smiley faces. They have to at the same time play good cop and bad cop. And the bad cop, as we've seen for the last few years, is the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who said, quote, only one really bad thing exists, and that's World War III. I hope Donald understands that escalation is not a game. Not everyone gets to walk away from the table. Some burn with their cities, end quote. It's a great quote. To put this in the context, this is not a one-off. Dmitry Medvedev has made more than 50 threats of nuclear war or global annihilation since 2022. So if you think this is something to be afraid of, and it's something that, unfortunately, people who don't study Russia, who chime in about what it means, what Medvedev is saying, don't understand the context. They don't understand that Medvedev always plays this role. This is his role. This is a communication strategy. So for those who doubt, let me cite just a few of the most memorable lines in the last couple of years. So on February 25th, 2023, quote, Ukraine will disappear. NATO will suffer terrible consequences, and it will all happen with the push of a red button. Next quote, March 22nd, 2023. If the West continues down this course, missiles will rain down, and not only on Kiev. July 5th, 2023. The West is dragging the world into a nuclear winter. December 2023. Any NATO country delivering tanks to Ukraine should be prepared to be wiped off the map. February 2024. He issued 12 more nuclear warnings, including that, quote, if American troops enter into Ukraine, they will return in coffins if they return at all. So I think it's very important to understand what Dmitry Medvedev is saying is not public policy, and it should not be interpreted as such. Medvedev's role is not as a negotiator. He is not sent to the negotiations. He is most likely not privy to the negotiations. He says what Putin cannot say. He creates fear, he generates confusion, and he generates headlines. So while Medvedev raged about, by the way, in English, very importantly to note this, he does a lot of this in English, the Russian media went into censorship mode. So Rossiya Один, Первый канал, both major national channels, REN TV, censored Trump's comments. And they never aired on Russian TV. They recycled older clips, though, of Trump criticizing Zelensky and Biden. So why is that? Why is it that Russian TV would decide that it's not going to show Trump's quotes? Why is it they had a different narrative tonight? In fact, Tsargrad TV's major narrative tonight was that Trump is under duress and being threatened. There are people in the West forcing him to do things against his will. Strange. But what's the goal? Why the censorship? Why these stories about coercion? It's because they want to keep Trump's image clean within Russia. Because in the eyes of Moscow, Trump might still be a soft landing. He still might provide opportunities. And he still might be the guy who cuts off aid to Ukraine, or who lifts the sanctions on Russia, or who divides NATO. And so they do their best to protect his reputation and erase anything that contradicts the narrative they have about him. So we can say that there's really a two-track narrative strategy that occurs in Russia, the one that we saw play out today. So tier one is the Kremlin. It's calm, measured, diplomatic, speaks to international capitals, Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and pretends to be the reasonable adult in the room. That's Peskov, saying, we're not offended by anything that Trump said. More than that, we appreciate what he's done for peace. Sounds very reasonable. But then you have everyone else who jumps on. You have the attack dogs. Medvedev, of course, is at the very front of that pack. You have Solovyov, Skabeeva, Tsargrad TV, and others. And they're just full of conspiracy theories, nuclear blackmail, and they speak to the Russian voters. They terrorize the foreign audiences, but this is classic autocratic tactic. The regime is playing both roles, both the rational negotiator and the lunatic aggressor. To quote Garry Kasparov, dictators survive by keeping everyone off balance. They're not crazy. They're pretending to be. So Medvedev is the Kremlin's calculated madness. He is a threat meant to look unhinged, but he's used like a scalpel. He's used specifically for various roles. It's not arbitrary. It's not random. But there's another reason that we see this. The Kremlin doesn't like to hear things like Putin is absolutely crazy coming out of the mouth of the US president, because it takes away the illusion that Putin is well respected by everybody. That those in the West, even though they criticize him, they respect him. That's very important for Russian propaganda, and it's something that was exposed as being false by Trump's statements. Now, Trump openly showing contempt or lack of respect for Putin, what can be said? Well, for the Russians, it's very hard to justify, so it's easier to censor. And when official statements are needed to be made, such as by Peskov, he blames it on the workload that Trump has, but doesn't give credence to it. He doesn't say that he accepts what the president said or tries to interpret what the president said. He dismisses it as essentially being an error caused by the US president. It was by mistake that he said that Putin was crazy. He's just too tired from so much work. He's fighting too hard for peace right now, and so he misspoke. It's fascinating. So the Russians censor the insult. They send out Dmitry Medvedev to go scream about nuclear warfare. They maintain Putin's image of being above the fray. He's calm. He's presidential. And it's amazing. This is Russian damage control. And it's a glimpse behind the curtain of how the Kremlin functions. And it's a regime that has staged its madness for decades. And it works. So what many people miss, especially when one is reading the comments, for instance, on social media, is that though Medvedev likes to parade as a drunk, raging, rogue lunatic, he's playing the cards that were dealt to him, and he knows he has to play. So ultimately, remember, in Russia, the real message is often hidden behind the loudest voice. There's usually much more to the story than what it first appears. So please do me a huge favor, like and subscribe to this channel. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for supporting Ukraine.